Hello, welcome to Moshang USA. It's Lydia. As we know, the Javelin missile has transformed the war in Ukraine. Here to discuss it today is Mr. Tom Hepper. Tom developed systems for neutralizing rockets and drones. He currently coaches teenager robotics teams. Tom was undergraduate at MIT. Good morning, Tom.
Hey, Dr. Liu, how are you?
I'm really good. Thank you, and it's great to have you back.
Glad to be here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the FGM-148 Javelin missile. It's been used with great success in Ukraine and elsewhere, and we'll talk about its operation, a little bit about its history, and a bit about its effectiveness. And this missile is a DARPA success story. This program started in DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and transitioned to the Army and is now in full production. And this is just a picture of the launch of the missile. The Javelin missile, of course, is right here. This is the launch tube with the soldier holding it. And you can see that it's a recoilless launch because the flame that comes out the back end is generated by a launch motor that burns entirely while it's inside the tube. So it's basically stopped burning out here so that the soldier doesn't get backblast from the missile, so that he can launch it safely, even from inside a room without getting harmed. And then later on, the flight motor will come on. So let's look at it a little bit more in detail. So this is the Javelin missile. It's in production by Lockheed Martin. Other half of it, the site, is made by Raytheon. We'll get that in a little bit. It's 5 inches in diameter. It's about 43 inches long, weighs about 35 pounds, and it has a range of over 4,000 meters. And the cost is, for just the missile, is about $175,000 per missile. And very briefly, up here is the seeker dome. So the seeker, which is an infrared camera, is right behind it. Then here's the contact fuse. This and this are the two warheads on the missile. So this small one here is the precursor charge. It goes off first as soon as the missile hits something. And then it clears certain things, specifically reactive armor, out of the way. These are the warhead initiation mechanisms. They get initiated from the rear. This is the main warhead right here. This is the electronic safe and arm and fusing function. That ensures that the missile doesn't go off until after it's been launched and is well away from the launch unit. And then in here is the launch motor, which is small and basically just gets it out of the tube. And then this is the flight motor, which is the main motor for propulsion. And that's what gets it going out to long distances. So this is the other half of the system. This is the site. It's called the Command and Launch Unit, or CLU. It's by Raytheon. It is an imaging infrared system, this being the large infrared lens. There's also a daylight camera up here. And the cost with the launch tube itself, this part, is about $75,000. So just as an example, if you order a bunch of missiles and not as many CLUs, the average price would be about $200,000. So when we appropriate $1 billion, that would come out to 5,000 missiles, which sounds like a lot, and it is. But as you may know, President Zelensky has said that he needs 500 of these javelins per day, which means that 5,000 missiles is 10 days supply. So that's what $1 billion buys in these missiles. They're pretty expensive. So one of the things that's unique about the Javelin missile is that it can fire a so-called line of sight trajectory that goes straight to whatever the target is, just like any other missile, or it can follow a lofted trajectory where it flies up high to about 500 feet and then dives in on the target at the end. And this provides two advantages. First of all, the roof of the target is generally a much bigger target than the frontal area of the target, and it's much less well armored. But the second advantage is that in Soviet tanks, Russian tanks, the ammunition is generally located down here along the floor. So if you're shooting straight like this, usually, unless you can get the shot way down here, you don't hit the ammunition. But with a lofted flight, you quite often do. And when the ammunition is struck by the jet from the shape charge, which I'll get into that in a little bit, it usually detonates. And that's why you see tanks with their turrets blown off lying around in Ukraine. So how did we get this weapon in the first place? Well, it was really the brainchild of Dr. James, we call him Jim Tignelia. He had come from the Army Night Vision Lab where he was working on infrared focal plane arrays. And they were thinking of using them principally as target detection mechanisms and maybe as sights for guns. But he had the idea of using the infrared focal plane array, which sees the heat image of a target or a scene. He thought of using them as missile seekers. And so he initiated a competition under the name Tank Breaker. That was the original name of the program back around 1979 to see whether it was possible to use infrared focal plane arrays as missile seekers. Now you have to remember, in 1979, image processing barely existed, and it took generally a very long time. You couldn't do it in real time. This is back when Atari was making most of the games that people used. And you know what kind of imagery they had and what a hard thing it was to process images. So a lot of people doubted that it could be done successfully. But he actually got 4 contractors to bid on the contract, and 2 of them were moderately successful with their missile and did end-to-end testing. So it so happened that around the same time, 1984 or 3, thereabouts, the Army had its own anti-tank missile program stood up, which was called Advanced Anti-Armor Weapon System Medium. It's not the heavy missile, but the medium shoulder-fired missile. And they had their own preferred solutions, which were a laser beam rider, where the operator of the missile shines a laser beam on the target, and then the missile basically follows the laser beam all the way to the target, and a fiber optic guided missile, where you actually would deploy a fiber optic from the rear of the missile as it flies, and the operator could see the image of the target through the missile seeker the whole way to the target. Now, the problem with both of these is that they are pretty much limited to line of sight, straight trajectories like this one up here. Whereas with the infrared fire and forget seeker, you can have top attack, but you also get another huge advantage, which is that with these, your beam rider and the fiber optic, the gunner has to keep looking at the target for the entire time of flight of the missile, which can be 30 seconds or more. And so if the tank target sees the gunner or sees the missile, it can shoot back at him. And then if he ducks or flinches, then the missile goes off course and it doesn't hit. Whereas with the fire and forget missile, the gunner can immediately take cover as soon as he fires the missile, and it doesn't matter to the missile. The missile is on its own. So the Army didn't like that concept. They said, well, you fire and the missile forgets. But they were forced into a competition, and it turned out that the Tank Breaker missile won. So it became the official AWSM competitor, and it got full-scale development award in 1989, and that went to a combination of Texas Instruments and Martin Marietta. So that's how the missile got started, and it's all due to this man right here, Jim Tignelia, who incidentally was also the father of a number of other important Army systems, such as the J-STARS radar and many other things. So he is really a giant in the field, and it's all due to DARPA. Now I'm going to digress for just a moment and tell you about how the warhead works, because it's really an amazing thing. So we start with the hollow charge principle, which in this country is called the Monroe effect, named after Charles Monroe from the Naval Torpedo Station. And this effect had generally been known for about a century, but it hadn't been applied by the military. So he demonstrated convincingly that a hollow charge has more penetration capability than a solid explosive charge. And the way that he did that was he took, this is a block of explosive right here, and he printed USN, United States Navy, and then the year, 1884. And he put it on top of a piece of steel with the face down and detonated it. And you can see that the letters USN and 1884 were inscribed into the steel in channels. And an illustration of this is down here below, where they've taken section pieces of explosive and steel and shown what happened when they did the experiment. So they have a bottle-shaped piece of explosive right here, and this is just a big chunk of steel. So if you just detonate this plain flat bottom bottle, you get a small crater like this. If you hollow it out, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a hollow part in this bottle here. You get a much deeper crater in the steel. And then they found, and this is the important part, that if you put a metal liner inside the hollowed out part, you got a much deeper hole in the steel. So that's the genesis of the so-called shaped charge. And I'm going to show you how that works. It's really quite interesting. So this is a computer model of a shaped charge. And the blue part is just the casing made of steel or something like that. And then the yellow part is explosive. And then the red part is the metal liner, which is typically copper or something like that. And what's going to happen is they're going to start the explosion back here at the back end. The explosion will start at the back, and then the explosion will propagate into the explosive, going from left to right. And you'll see that the copper liner begins to collapse, and it forms a jet that goes out the front, and it goes extremely fast. This also shows somewhat the same thing, although at a later stage. So this shows a shaped charge that has been initiated, and there's a metal liner in here. They haven't shown it in this illustration, but it's collapsing, and it's forming a jet of essentially molten metal that's going extremely fast. This is truly one of the wonders of nature. The tip of this jet can be going as fast as 10 kilometers a second, which is Mach 30. And it has almost no strength, but it has tremendous velocity. And so the jet has a gradient in velocity. So the tip is going faster than the tail. So it stretches and stretches and stretches. And simply because of its momentum and the pressure that it applies to a steel bar such as this one, it penetrates in and it penetrates in farther and farther. And then eventually the jet stretches so much that it doesn't hold together anymore. And it turns into particles. And then those have less penetrating power, but nevertheless, they still can penetrate a lot of steel. And in fact, modern shaped charges can penetrate 10 times their diameter into steel, which means that a 4-inch diameter warhead can penetrate over 1 meter of solid steel. So think about that.
You just mentioned like the speed is like 10 miles per second. If compared to the speed of the flight, roughly what's the conversion?
It's much faster than any airplane, much faster. The only other man-made objects that get that fast are spacecraft.
Oh, okay.
10 kilometers a second. So the speed of sound is about 300 meters per second. So commercial aircraft don't even go that fast. They don't go Mach 1. 300 meters a second is about the speed of sound, which is Mach 1. Fighter aircraft, the really fast ones, can go Mach 2, maybe even Mach 3. So that's 600 or maybe about 1,000 meters per second. This goes 10,000 meters per second, much faster than anything else on Earth, except, rocket ships in space. They can go those kinds of speeds, but
Okay.
Nothing else on Earth. And it's a very simple thing, and anyone can make it, and many people have. So that's how a shape charge works. So for many years, that meant that even small shape charges could penetrate any tank in the world. In fact, just a 2-inch shape charge like the US bazooka or a 3-inch shape charge like the Russian RPG, they could go through the armor of any tank in the world. So you could make very small anti-tank weapons like the bazooka and like the RPG. And this is another illustration that just shows a small shape charge going off here. The jet begins to form, and then a little bit later, this is a different time sequence here, but the jet has stretched and it goes through this thick piece of armor, which is as thick as anybody could possibly put on a tank. So for many years, that was the way it was. The tanks couldn't really do anything about these small anti-tank weapons. But then in the late 70s, people discovered and improved reactive armor. And this is one version that has explosive in the middle. So now what happens is the shape charge jet hits this sandwich, which is composed of a metal, they call them flyer plates, a thin metal plate in the front and in the back, and then explosive in the middle. So when the shape charge jet hits, these plates begin to fly apart in this direction and this direction. And that disrupts the jet because it wipes along the jet. And so what comes out the back is a bunch of disrupted particles that have much less penetration power. So now the steel that was originally perforated by the shape charge jet only gets dented by the small fragments that are left after the explosive reactive armor has detonated. So that was the new innovation that allowed tanks to overcome anti-tank weapons on the battlefield. And so you'll see this on the Russian tanks that have gone into Ukraine. So the reactive armor is these tiles up here on the turret, and then they're hard to see, but there's another row of them facing downward on the underside right here. And then they've also put, I believe that these are reactive skirts on the side so that shots from the side also become disrupted. And so you can see that the turret of the tank for direct fire weapons is pretty well protected. And even the rest of the tank, if they can get behind a little hill so that only the turret is exposed, it's going to be very difficult for an anti-tank weapon to hit any surface that isn't protected by reactive armor. However, Javelin does two things to overcome that. Well, three things really. So first of all, Javelin doesn't come in straight in this direction. It comes in from the top. So even if it hits these reactive armor plates, they're not flying at an angle to the jet. They're flying along the jet. So once they become perforated by the jet, they no longer interact with it. So the jet from the warhead is much more effective. But also, Javelin will generally hit up in this area on top, which is not protected by reactive armor, because that's where the hatches for the gunner are, and some of the electronics and the sights and things like that, that you really can't put armor over. So that's the real secret. And this area, the whole total top area of the tank is much bigger than the side area. So it's difficult for it to hide. So that's why Javelin is so much more effective. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if it comes in from the top like this, and the jet penetrates down into the bottom and hits the ammunition, then generally the tank will blow up and be completely destroyed. Mm-hmm. What have the Russians tried to do about this? Well, they put some improvised countermeasures over the top. This is an example of one that is trying to do two things. First of all, to change the signature so that the missile would become confused. If it flies in from here, it won't look like what it thinks a tank should look like. And also, if the missile comes in and hits up here, then it will detonate from a little bit farther away, and they hope that maybe that will keep it from being effective. So the question is, have these countermeasures worked? Well, here's what the Kiev Independent has to say about that. They claim that as of the 27th of March, that they've been able to kill 582 Russian tanks, 1,664 armored personnel carriers, over 1,000 other vehicles, and some helicopters and planes. Now, those weren't all with Javelin. Some of those were with Stingers, but these were not with Stingers. These were mostly Javelins and some other anti-tank weapons.
I have a question here. So
yes.
Zelensky asked for 500 Javelin missiles every day. So
Right.
what's the successful rate of those missiles hit its target? We know it can automatically find the objects. So what's the real successful rate in a battle? Do you know?
Well, I don't know what the success rate is, because I don't know how many missiles they've fired altogether. You know, in a real situation, you're lucky if the success rate of the mission is 50%. I think that Javelin, when it's used properly, has actually had a somewhat higher rate than that, but I'm really just speculating. I don't know, because I don't know how many missiles they've actually fired. In fact, they may not know either.
Yeah, it's hard to make the statistics, probably impossible.
Oh, they'll try to figure it out after the war, but right now they're too busy fighting, and I don't think that anyone has really tabulated that. But it has what's considered a very high mission effectiveness rate. I just don't know what that number is. So bottom line is this: it appears that the Javelin is a very effective weapon, even against modern tanks, and that it's been used with great success in Ukraine, and that we may have entered an unexpected area of warfare. Vladimir Putin expected his armor forces would be able to just operate with impunity against the lightly armored forces of Ukraine, and it appears that that was unfounded. So the Javelin missile is a large part of that success story in Ukraine, and we owe that to DARPA.
Thank you for your great presentation. So my question is, it has been on the market for a while, and we probably, I don't know, it's not just me or just in general that we didn't hear it very much. What's the reason behind it? Is that because the war scale, or because the type of war, some war doesn't use Javelin conveniently, or any other reason? So
yes, it's because its use has mostly been confined to the United States, and we have been the operator of the vehicles in most of the wars that we've been in since the year 2000. We haven't been taking on, the Taliban didn't do a lot of armored operations against us, nor did the Iraqis. It was the other way around. We had the armored vehicles. They were trying to kill them. They didn't have Javelin missiles. They had IEDs, which had their own form of effectiveness, but nothing like what the Javelin missile has. So this is the first time that their Javelin missile has been used defensively in a major conflict. And that's why all of a sudden you're hearing all about it.
Okay, makes sense. Also, the missile costs about 200,000 per missile. So in other words, the target of the missile could be much cheaper than itself, right? So the war is very expensive. I don't know what's the cost of averagely or a Russia tanks.
Well, it's a little bit hard to compute because Russia has a different economic system than we do, but our tanks cost in excess of $10 million. Russian tanks are generally a little bit cheaper than that, but they're certainly going to cost millions of dollars. So if you can take out let's just say a $4 or $5 million tank with a $200,000 missile, even if it takes a couple of them, that's an economic success. But that isn't actually the point. The real point is you're stopping the tank, or whatever it is, from doing its mission. And so you're winning the war. That's really what the valuation that has to be placed on this missile or any other weapon system. If it allows you to win the war, then it's paid for itself.
I agree. Also, I have a question regarding slides. Yeah, it's slides. So in the top of its slides, it shows a nicely curve of the Javelin missile. But indeed, when I look at those videos showing the fly of a Javelin missile, I saw a curvable shot. So especially at the beginning, probably a couple of seconds or 10 seconds, it first ejected from the soldier's side, do a flat flying, then it kind of like a jump of the launch exponential jump. Is that just some technique very basic or just very hard to?
It is very basic. I'll show you why it looks that way. So if you remember, in the missile, you have the launch motor and then you have the flight motor. And the launch motor fires while the missile is entirely inside the tube, and then it stops, because if the motor is still firing, it's going to blast the gunner, and you can't have that. It would kill him. So it has to be extinguished before it gets out of the tube. And you can see this is the fire from the launch motor here. So because the launch motor stops, and then the flight motor can't come on while it would impinge on the gunner. So it has to come on when the missile is well downrange, 20, 30 meters downrange. So as a result, there's no power to the missile from the time it leaves the tube until it's 20 or 30 meters downrange. So what that means is that the missile is going to start to fall before the flight motor comes on. So the missile has to be launched somewhat upward in the air, just as is shown here. So it goes up a little bit. So if I'll go back to this one. So what I've shown as a line of sight trajectory isn't quite right, in fact. So what the missile does is it has to launch a little bit up, but then it falls.
Yeah.
And then about here, the flight motor comes on, and then it either assumes, and it still has to go up a little bit to recover because it's falling, but then it's going to either follow more or less a line of sight trajectory, or it's going to go up and have the lofted top attack trajectory. So it will always be launched on a slightly upward trajectory, and then it will fall, and then it will reassume a slightly lofted trajectory until it decides on one that's mostly this way or mostly lofted.
Follow-up questions, because it needed to, after immediate launch, it falls a little bit. Will that affect the missile? I mean, sometimes it may hit the ground or may not be able to, in certain geography condition or open condition, it will prevent the missile to perform.
Yes, you're exactly right. The gunner has to select a position that doesn't have an obstruction out here. So generally that happens anyway, because he has to be able to see the target in order to launch the missile in the first place. But if there's something out here like a tree or a bush, it is possible that the missile could hit it and then it would work. So he has to choose a firing position that is appropriate for the flight of the missile.
The Javelin missile was, I think the first one was probably generated or innovated in 1998.
What's called the FSD period, which stands for full-scale development, was awarded in 1989. And that's when they really get all the bugs out of the system and make it so that it's soldier friendly, which is very important. You can make a system that is technically successful, but that soldiers can't operate, and that's still a failure. But FSD, so that typically takes about 4 years. So I'm going to say that in the mid to early 90s was when the what they call the low rate initial production phase was entered into. I don't know the exact date, but they start producing some at that point, and then they give them to soldiers, and they go out and do training exercises and use it and report back, oh, you need to fix this switch. It's in a bad place. I can't operate it with gloves on my hand, that kind of thing. And so then at some point, typically, 3 or 4 years after that, they go to full scale production. So yes, that would have probably been, the late 90s.
Thank you. Great presentation. And I really like this topic. I think that's pretty much for today. And thank you for your time and for the excellent expertise.